The idea of the tithe is a really interesting one to me.
You may have heard this. You're supposed to give 10% of your money to me, or to the church, I guess.
For a topic that is really only ever talked about negatively in the New Testament, it certainly has found its way into Christian lore. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where the tithe comes from, how we often in Christianity misunderstand the tithe in the Hebrew Scriptures. But first, even if you think about those New Testament passages that even mention a tenth or a tithe, that's primarily Matthew 23, Luke 18, and Luke 11, all of those passages are decidedly negative. It's Jesus calling out the hypocritical stances of people who pat themselves on the back for giving a tenth, but don't actually seem to reflect that same kind of generosity in their lives. Now, you do get one somewhat neutral reference in Hebrews 7, where we hear a reference to Abraham tithing to Melchizedek, but even the context of Hebrews is all about, here's one thing, and now there's something better. It's always a comparison between what was and what is better now in Jesus. So the reference is really only the signifier that's pointing to the full expression of that kind of generosity in Christian faith. So nowhere in the New Testament do we get a positive endorsement of the tithe, and yet it's something that just kind of hangs around in our churches today.
You may have heard this. You're supposed to give 10% of your money to me, or to the church, I guess. That's fine. We'd appreciate it and honor that gift, and that kind of generosity can be great. But that very specifically nice round number is actually a cultural more than a particularly biblical figure. Now, if you grew up in church, you're probably saying, well, it's a tithe, it's 10%, easy peasy, next question. The thing is, biblically, it's a little more complicated than that. See, the idea of a tithe comes from the Hebrew Scriptures, but in fact, it's a number of Hebrew Scriptures that have been conflated together over the years to get that number. See, for example, in Numbers 18:21, the Israelites are commanded to give a tithe or a tenth to the Levites in return for their work serving the community religiously. And essentially, what's going on here is that one of the 12 tribes of Israel has been tasked with caring for the religious duties of the nation, but in that role, they did not receive an inheritance of land like the other tribes. Instead, they were dependent on the generosity of others to care for them with a tithe. And that did two things. It kept the religious caste perpetually dependent on the people that they served, and it kept the need to share equitably within the community in front of everyone in the nation all the time. Okay, so all right, give 10% to your church, that's the modern equivalent, where's the problem? Well, the problem is, we're just getting started. Because a little while later, in Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 and 23, the people are then told to set aside another tenth of all their fields produce each year and to eat that tithe in the presence of the Lord so that they might learn to revere God always. Now this time, that tithe went to a big community meal, a party. And over time, as the nation grew, this became known as the festival tithe, and it created a large community fund that covered all the expenses of all the religious festivals throughout all of the Jewish calendar. So we're up to 20% now, but we're still not done because just 5 verses later in Deuteronomy 14:28, we read that at the end of every 3 years, you are to bring another tithe of that year's produce and store it in your town so that foreigners and the fatherless and widows may come and eat. So there was a third tithe meant to care for the marginalized. And by the way, if you have ever heard any pastor ever quote the book of Malachi, where God says, you are robbing me by withholding your tithes from the storehouse and then equating that to your generosity to the church, that is a blatant and hopefully unintentional misrepresentation of what is going on in Malachi. The storehouse tithe, whenever you read about it, is specifically and only to care for the needy within the community. It has nothing to do with giving your money to the church, sorry. Still, all of this means that On an annualized basis, the Israelites were tithing 23.3% of their income, not to mention the fact that they were also told to leave the edges of their fields unharvested so that anyone who happened to be walking by and found themselves hungry could take what they need. So these resources were used to care for the religious caste, to fund the religious practices of the community, and to provide a social safety net for anyone that needed it within the community. Now, all of those remain good things to point your generosity at today. In fact, all of them have an equivalent in the New Testament. For example, Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 9 about pastors deserving their pay, and in Mark 12, Jesus praises a poor widow for putting 2 simple coins into the religious treasury. In Acts 2, we hear about the early Christian community coming together, sharing everything that they have to care for those in need among them. But nowhere in the teachings of Jesus, nor in the writings of Paul, in fact, nowhere in the New Testament at all do we ever find a tithe or a figure like 10% attached to any of these ongoing needs or your generosity. Truthfully, the only time that Jesus talks about tithes is decidedly negative. His preference, which we see very clearly in Mark 12, is for uncoerced generosity. Now look, everyone on staff here, including me, benefits from your generosity. And we are able to worship together and keep these lights on. Because of your generosity, we have incredible programs like the Commons Cupboard that provides food for anyone in the neighborhood whenever they need it. And all of that happens because of your generosity. And you might decide that a nice round number like 10% is a good number for you to shoot toward in terms of your generosity. But if we are making an honest, like comparison here, your generosity today exists alongside all the taxes that we also vote for and pay, and that provide a social safety net in our communities as well. Now, obviously, that's not where all of your taxes go. And so my point is not that you should not be generous in addition to your taxes. In fact, I will argue exactly the opposite today. It's good for your soul to be generous. But what I want to take off the table before we even begin our conversation today is an inappropriate religious obligation that does not exist in Christianity. Not only is that kind of religious coercion antithetical to the way of Jesus, in my experience, it will inevitably make it incredibly difficult to hold on to your faith for the long haul.